Hagen, when you study mate selection, which is kind of the study of how people choose long-term partners, there are a variety of different things that kind of universally across cultures have a tendency to be valued. People have a tendency to value physical appearance. They have a tendency to value ability to provide, or at least be on the same financial level as their potential mate. Yet consistently, when they do studies, one of the things that almost always is near the top is a listening ability. Primarily because when people look at listening, they see it as an act of respect. David Isay wrote a reasonably famous book simply entitled Listening is an Act of Love. And so when we look at listening as a concept, understand that it is not just something that could potentially benefit us on a workplace level or even in a group setting. I think listening's biggest focus is probably on an interpersonal level. It has tremendous value to it. I think that this lecture might end up being a little longer than my normal 7 or 8 minutes one, so bear with me on this, but there's some really cool concepts for it. Let's share some screen here, and as we do that, as we will, we go through and we slide this over. This is the awkward part of the presentation as I get to our title slide on effective listening issues and solutions. I can't say I'm getting better at the PowerPoints. I am enjoying them more. So one of the big keys is to separate the difference between listening and hearing. And on a very simple level, hearing is a physical process and listening as a psychological process. Think of it this way. If you've ever been in a class, this used to happen to me when I was 18, 19, 20 years old in college, and especially in a class that I didn't have a lot of interest in. The teacher would have a PowerPoint up, and let's say it was going to be a list of 7 different things. And for the first 2 things, I had some pretty clear notes, and I was following along with what the instructor of that class said. And then I'd look down at my sheet of paper and think of something else, music, potential girlfriend, whatever it happened to be. And I'd look up, and the teacher would be on item 7, and I'd look down at my watch. I've always been a watch person, and I'd be like, oh, I've stared at that piece of paper for like 45 consecutive minutes. And what was happening in that situation was that my ability to hear hadn't gone away. It's not that I had physically plugged my ears. My focus had gone somewhere else. And so I had functionally chosen to stop my ability to listen. And so the difference between the two is that one is a physical process and the other is a psychological process. And there are a series of different challenges, some would call them barriers, to effective listening. And a lot of these are situational for people, yet in many situations, as you look through some of these and read some of these definitions, you might find that you are more apt to struggle with some more than others. As an example, you might struggle with a failure to focus on a fairly regular basis. Yet some others of you could look at that and be like, no, I'm usually pretty good at focusing, especially on things that I'm really interested in, but I have a tendency to pull my phone out quite a bit or think about what could be on my phone even if it's not out. And so it's a lot more of a distraction that is situational. As we go forward, though, some of these are actually like pretty challenging. The idea of judging too soon, or the idea of, as it was explained to me many years ago by a man named Daniel Cron Mills, it is the difference between listening and waiting to talk. And I found myself in many situations where somebody will start a conversation. Maybe they've got a story that's trying to prove a point, and I'll hear that story. Notice that I won't listen to that story. I'll hear that story, but the moment they start off, I'll say, like, I have a better story that will actually explain your point better. to you. Notice how I don't say those things out loud, but it's what I think. And as long as I think that, off of that judging too soon, prejudgment in many ways, what ends up happening is their story doesn't carry the weight that it should actually for me. Now, this last one, I really want to take a little bit of time, and it's the idea of listening anxiety. And it's functionally an idea that listening is, in fact, stressful. That being able to add on to an amount that we've listened to already actually is something that is reasonably difficult. Now, each of these listening barriers or listening challenges presents with it some different approaches towards solving that. It's not just the like, hey, stop doing that. There is a reasonable approach that will help us through these. It's called the HURIER model. Now, keep in mind that because this is a social science and not a hard science, it's not a, hey, do this and everything will get better. But the HURIER technique has worked for a variety of people in the past. And what it allows us to do is it allows us to move from that physical process, which is the start in the H, and work through a situation where we can distill that information through our understanding and our choice of what we need to remember later. So these first three are essentially taking us from the idea of I physically heard this all the way into what am I going to need to remember for the future. I found in the past that simply being able to remember another human being's name allows them to perceive me as respectful of them, even if I haven't talked to them in a very long time. And partially that is because when I was younger, I was taught when you're first introduced to somebody and they tell you your name, that is the thing that you need to be able to connect with, that you need to be able to connect that face with that name so that in the future, when you see them, they'll be excited that you remembered that particular thing about them. But we're only halfway done with this. I squeezed all of this because I wanted to get it all into one PowerPoint. If this were a presentation in UC 120, I would actually be pretty upset with that now in hindsight as I look at it. So from our idea of we've chosen what we are going to remember through that, we're then going to interpret that. And in a lot of situations, that's going to come through asking specific questions, trying to help us gain a better understanding by understanding the other person, the speaker's message a little bit better. We're then going to evaluate that to decide how influential that message should be. And we're going to do that by trying to reduce our own bias in the situation. And the last step is actually the response back to that person with a couple of goals in that the first in that response is to show that we have an understanding of what was communicated with us. But then the second is to allow us the opportunity to, when we restate it, to make sure not just that we listened properly, that we heard it properly, separate the difference between the two, but also that our interpretation of that message is the interpretation that the other person in the communication event wanted for us. This can, keep in mind, continue on a transaction level. It can go back and forth, and it can go back and forth at the same time. So if you're like, Seth, is it really a 6-step process? I'd say like the answer is yes, but in many situations, we might have to go back to certain aspects of the steps. So it could be a HURIER model, but in many situations, it could be a HURIER model. That's terrible. It's almost as if I don't write these things down and just start the PowerPoint and start looking at the camera. But the truth is actually there. In many situations, the actual art of communication, the art of listening, is being able to go back and continue to reassess whether or not we have the proper message. So let's start the awkward point where I actually remember how to stop the sharing model. There's our stop share situation. So when we look at listening on a totality, I want us to be able to understand that listening is a skill. And because it's a skill, with effective practice and effective understanding of proper methods, we can get better at it. People aren't born naturally effective listeners. It's a skill. And because of that, we can, in fact, improve it. So let's start. All right. Have a great day, guys. Oh, thanks for listening.